Velthar stood at attention as the transport ship's doors opened with a sharp hiss. The metal floor beneath his feet vibrated with the steady hum of the engines. Around him, other Catherian warriors checked their plasma rifles one last time. Their dark blue skin gleamed under the ship's lights, and their natural armor plates clinked softly as they moved. This was just another mission, another planet to defend, another enemy to crush. Velthar had done this dozens of times before. The Catherian Empire had never lost a battle, and today would be no different. The briefing had been simple. The hegemony was attacking multiple worlds across the galaxy. The Galactic Council had formed an alliance of different species to fight back. Velthar would be working with aliens from other worlds. Some he had heard of. Others were new to him. But one species made him shake his head in disbelief. Humans. Velthar had read the files about humans during the long journey. They were young. Their technology was basic. They used metal bullets instead of energy weapons. They needed thick armor to protect their soft skin. Their lifespans were short. Their bodies were weak compared to most galactic species. Why the Council had included them in this alliance was beyond Velthar's understanding. Perhaps they needed the numbers. Perhaps it was politics. But expecting humans to fight against the hegemony seemed like sending children to battle monsters. The transport touched down on the landing pad with a gentle bump. Velthar could see through the windows that they had arrived at Forward Base Alpha. The military base was built into the rocky surface of Kepler 442b, a mining colony that the hegemony wanted to capture. As Velthar walked down the ramp, he breathed in the thin air. His enhanced lungs had no trouble with the atmosphere, but he noticed some of the other alien species were already putting on breathing masks. The humans would probably need them too. The base commander, a tall Zentorian with gray skin, pointed toward a cluster of buildings. "Your unit assignments are in Building 7. Report to your squad leaders immediately." Velthar made his way across the compound. He passed groups of different aliens preparing for battle. Reptilian saurians cleaned their weapons. Insect-like Vespians buzzed around supply crates. A few massive Goliaths moved heavy equipment with their forearms. Building 7 was smaller than the others. Inside, a hologram showed the layout of the colony and the expected attack routes. Several aliens were already gathered around a metal table studying maps and tactical data. A voice spoke from behind Velthar. "You must be our Catherian specialist." Velthar turned around. Standing there was a human male wearing standard military armor. The armor looked heavy and crude compared to Velthar's sleek gear. The human was shorter than Velthar, with black hair and dark eyes. His skin was a light brown color. "I am Velthar of the Catherian Third Fleet," Velthar said, giving a formal bow. "Captain Lee Taman, Human Defense Corps," the human replied. He did not bow back. Instead, he extended his hand. Velthar stared at it for a moment before remembering that humans shook hands as a greeting. The human's grip was firm but brief. "Let me introduce you to the rest of the squad," Captain Lee said. He led Velthar to the table where 4 other humans were standing. "This is Corporal Park Jiho, our demolitions expert." A stocky human with serious eyes nodded at Velthar. His hands were stained with what looked like explosive residue. "Private Kim Sora handles medical and communications." A female human with her hair tied back looked up from a radio device. She was smaller than the others but moved with confident precision. "Sergeant Yoon Dong-soo is our marksman." A lean human was cleaning a long rifle with careful movements. He barely glanced at Velthar before returning to his weapon. "And Lieutenant Choi Hee-jin coordinates our tactics." The last human was a female with sharp eyes who was studying the tactical display. She looked at Velthar for a long moment, as if measuring him. Velthar studied each human in return. They all looked so ordinary, so fragile. Their equipment was basic metal and plastic. Their weapons used chemical explosives to fire metal projectiles, primitive by any galactic standard. But something bothered Velthar. He could not put his finger on what it was. The humans moved with purpose. They spoke in calm, measured tones. When they looked at him, there was no fear or awe in their eyes. Most alien species showed some respect when meeting a Catherian warrior. These humans treated him like any other soldier. Captain Lee spread out a detailed map on the table. Intelligence says the hegemony will hit us in 3 waves, he said. First, scout units to test our defenses. Then their main assault force. Finally, their shock troops to break any remaining resistance. Velthar looked at the map. The colony had good defensive positions, but the hegemony was known for overwhelming attacks. How many defenders do we have? He asked. About 500 mixed species, Lieutenant Choi replied. The hegemony is bringing at least 3,000. 3,000. Velthar had faced bad odds before, but never 6 to 1. Still, Kitherian warriors were worth 10 of any enemy. With good tactics and superior firepower they could hold. What do you know about hegemony forces? Sergeant Yoon asked, still cleaning his rifle. Velthar straightened up, finally, a question where his experience mattered. They use bioengineered creatures. Fast, strong, hard to kill. They attack in swarms and don't retreat. They also use psychological warfare to break enemy morale. The humans exchanged glances. Velthar expected to see worry or fear on their faces. Instead, Corporal Park just nodded and said, "Good to know." Private Kim looked up from her radio. Supply drop incoming in 20 minutes. Food, ammunition, and medical supplies. I'll check the perimeter sensors, Lieutenant Choi said, walking toward a bank of monitors. The humans went about their preparations with calm efficiency. Velthar watched them work and felt increasingly puzzled. These creatures should be nervous. The hegemony had a reputation that made even veteran warriors uneasy. Yet these humans acted like they were preparing for a training exercise. Maybe they simply did not understand what they were facing. Maybe their short lifespans meant they had not learned proper caution. Or maybe they were just too primitive to grasp the danger. Captain Lee noticed Velthar watching them. "Something wrong?" he asked. "No," Velthar replied. "I was just wondering if your people understand what we're up against." The human captain smiled, but it was not a happy expression. "We understand," he said quietly. "We always understand." There was something in his voice that made Velthar pause, something cold and hard that did not match the captain's calm demeanor. For just a moment, Velthar felt like he was looking at something dangerous wearing a friendly mask. But the moment passed and Captain Lee was just another human soldier again. Velthar decided he was imagining things. Stress before battle could play tricks on the mind. The alarm rang across the base. A voice came over the speakers. "All units to battle stations. Enemy scouts detected. This is not a drill." The humans immediately grabbed their gear and headed for the door. Velthar followed, checking his plasma rifle and energy shields. Time to show these primitive allies how real warriors fought. As they took their positions along the defensive walls, Velthar felt the familiar calm that came before battle. He had fought in dozens of conflicts. He knew his weapons. He trusted his training. The hegemony might be dangerous, but they had never faced Kitherian military might. Looking down at the human soldiers beside him, Velthar almost felt sorry for them. They were about to see what real war looked like. The first hegemony scout emerged from the purple mist that covered the valley below. Velthar raised his plasma rifle and looked through the scope. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. It was not like the creatures in the intelligence reports. This thing had once been humanoid, but the hegemony had changed it. Extra arms sprouted from its back, its legs bent at wrong angles. Bone spikes pushed through its skin. Most disturbing of all, parts of its original face were still visible beneath the biomodifications. More scouts appeared, dozens of them. They moved in jerky, unnatural ways like broken puppets. Some crawled on too many legs, others had wings, made of stretched skin. All of them had been twisted into something that hurt to look at. Velthar had read about hegemony bioengineering, but seeing it was different. These creatures had been people once. The hegemony took prisoners and changed them into weapons. The thought made Velthar's stomach turn. "First contact," Lieutenant Choi's voice crackled over the radio. "All units hold fire until they reach the red markers." Velthar watched the scouts approach the defensive lines. They moved strangely, stopping to sniff the air or examine the ground. Some of them let out sounds that were almost like words, almost like they were trying to remember how to speak. A Saurian warrior 2 positions down from Velthar made a low hissing noise. "This is wrong," the reptilian said. "They were people." "Stay focused," Captain Lee's voice came through the comm. "Remember your training. When the scouts reached the red markers, every defender opened fire at once. Velthar's plasma bolts burned through the first creatures easily. Around him, other aliens used energy weapons, projectile guns, and beam cannons. The valley lit up. With weapon fire, the scouts died quickly. Too quickly. Velthar frowned as he watched the last one fall. "That was easy," he said into his radio. "Too easy," Sergeant Yoon replied from his sniper position. "They weren't trying to fight. They were testing our positions." Before anyone could respond, the ground began to shake. A deep, rumbling sound came from beyond the valley. Then the main assault force appeared. Velthar had fought many enemies, but nothing had prepared him for this. Thousands of creatures poured out of the mist. Some were bio-modified like the scouts, but others were completely alien. Living tanks with too many eyes. Flying creatures that screamed as they moved. Massive worms that burrowed through the ground. But the worst were the ones that looked normal. Human prisoners who had been changed just enough to follow orders but not enough to hide what they used to be. They wore the torn remains of civilian clothes. Some still had family photos in their pockets. "All units, open fire." Captain Lee ordered. The battle began in earnest. Velthar fired his plasma rifle as fast as he could. Each shot killed or wounded a creature, but more kept coming. The other defenders were doing the same, but the enemy numbers seemed endless. A flying creature dove at Velthar's position. He rolled aside and fired upward, burning a hole through its wing. It crashed into the wall behind him, still trying to bite at him with 3 different mouths. "Reload," Corporal Park shouted. Velthar saw the human switching power cells in his weapon. The process took several seconds, leaving him vulnerable. Velthar provided cover fire until Park was ready. Again, the assault continued for an hour. The defenders held their ground, but barely. Velthar noticed that some of the alien troops were starting to look shaken. A group of Vespians had stopped firing and were just staring at the attacking horde. 2 Zentaurians had retreated to the bunkers. Then the real horror began. A new sound came from the valley. Not roaring or screaming, but singing. Human voices singing a children's song. The voices were wrong, distorted, but still recognizable. Velthar looked down and saw them. A group of human children walking toward the defensive lines. They had been modified like the other prisoners, but lightly. They still looked mostly human. They were singing as they walked, holding hands like they were playing a game. "Don't look at them." Captain Lee's voice was sharp over the radio. "Focus on the real threats," but Velthar could not look away. Behind the children came more prisoners. Families that had been captured and changed. Parents carrying babies that were no longer quite human. Elderly people who moved with unnatural speed on twisted legs. The psychological impact was immediate. Several alien defenders stopped shooting. A Goliath threw down his weapon and walked away from his position. Velthar heard someone vomiting over the radio. Velthar felt something he had never experienced before. His hands began to shake. His breathing became rapid and shallow. His hearts pounded in his chest so hard he could hear them. Cold sweat ran down his back beneath his armor. This was fear. Real, paralyzing fear. He had always thought fear was for weak species. Catherians were bred for war. They had genetic modifications that removed most emotional responses during combat. Fear was supposed to be impossible for him. But watching those children sing as they walked toward the guns, Velthar understood that some things were worse than death. Some things could break even the strongest mind. The hegemony was not just trying to kill them. They were trying to destroy their will to fight. They were using captured civilians as weapons, forcing the defenders to choose between shooting innocents or letting the enemy advance. Around him, more defenders were breaking. The carefully planned defense was falling apart as soldiers either stopped fighting or abandoned their positions. The hegemony creatures were getting closer to the walls. Velthar tried to raise his rifle, but his hands were shaking too badly. to aim. His enhanced reflexes and tactical training meant nothing when his mind was screaming at him to run. Then he heard something that cut through the chaos, the sound of human weapons firing. Velthar looked to his left and saw the human squad still at their positions. Captain Lee was methodically shooting at the real threats behind the prisoners. Private Kim was calling out target locations over the radio. Sergeant Yoon was picking off flying creatures with precise shots. They were not looking at the prisoners. They were not listening to the singing. They were focused entirely on the military targets, but Velthar could see that they were affected. Captain Lee's jaw was clenched so tight that muscles stood out in his neck. Private Kim's voice had a slight tremor. Sergeant Yoon was gripping his rifle so hard his knuckles were white. The humans were afraid too. Velthar could see it in their body language, hear it in their voices. They were just as horrified as everyone else. But they kept fighting. How? Velthar whispered into his radio. Captain Lee's response was quiet but clear. Because if we stop, more people become like them. Lieutenant Choi's voice came over the general comm channel. All units, focus fire on grid reference 77 Alpha. Ignore everything else. Slowly, other defenders began to follow the human example. They stopped, looking at the prisoners and focused on the actual military targets. The defense began to stabilize. But Velthar could feel something had changed inside him. The absolute confidence he had always felt in battle was gone. The certainty that Catherian training made him superior to any challenge had cracked. For the first time in his life, Velthar was truly afraid, and he was fighting beside the only species that seemed to know how to function while terrified. The battle was far from over. According to the intelligence reports, this was just the second wave. The hegemony's shock troops were still coming. Velthar looked at his shaking hands and wondered if he would survive long enough to understand how the humans did it. How they could be afraid and still fight. How they could face horror and not break. He was about to learn that some lessons could only be taught in the crucible of absolute terror. The second wave retreated after 3 hours of fighting. Velthar slumped against the defensive wall, his plasma rifle hot in his trembling hands. Around him, the other defenders were checking wounds and counting ammunition. Many positions were now empty. Too many soldiers had broken and fled. Casualty report. Captain Lee's voice came over the radio. His tone was steady, professional, but Velthar could hear the exhaustion underneath. 17% combat losses, Lieutenant Choi replied. Another 23% psychological casualties. We're down to about 300 effective fighters. 300 against whatever was coming next. Velthar closed his eyes and tried to steady his breathing. The fear was still there, sitting in his chest like a cold weight. Every time he thought about those singing children, his hands started shaking again. A shadow fell across him. Velthar opened his eyes to see Private Kim standing nearby with a medical kit. "You're hurt," she said, pointing to his left arm. Velthar looked down. Blood was seeping through a tear in his armor. He had not even noticed getting wounded. The adrenaline and fear had blocked out the pain. "It's nothing," he said. "Let me clean it," Kim replied. She knelt beside him and began working on the wound. Her hands were steady as she applied antiseptic and bandages. This might sting a little. As she worked, Velthar studied her face. Kim was young, probably barely an adult by human standards. Her armor was scratched and dented from the battle. There were dark circles under her eyes, but her movements were calm and precise. "How do you do it?" Velthar asked quietly. "Do what?" Kim replied, not looking up from his arm. "Stay calm. Keep fighting. I saw what that battle did to the others. I felt it myself. But your people..." Velthar paused, trying to find the right words. "You were afraid too, I could tell. But you did not break." Kim finished with the bandage and sat back on her heels. For a moment she did not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was very quiet. "My little brother was taken by raiders when I was 12, she said. "I know what happens to people who get captured by monsters. I know what they become." She looked directly at Velthar. "I'm terrified. We all are. But being scared doesn't change what needs to be done." Before Velthar could respond, alarms began, blaring again. Captain Lee's voice cut through the noise. Incoming! Third wave! All units to positions! Velthar grabbed his rifle and looked toward the valley. What he saw made his newly bandaged wound throb with pain. The hegemony's shock troops were not like the previous waves. These creatures were massive armored bioconstructs the size of buildings. They moved on dozens of legs, each step shaking the ground. Weapon pods covered their backs, firing energy blasts that lit up the sky. Behind them came smaller but deadlier creatures. Velthar recognized them from intelligence reports. Harvesters. They were designed to capture living beings and transform them into new hegemony units in real time. Their bodies were covered in surgical tools and injection systems. "This is it," Sergeant Yoon said over the radio. "They're sending everything they have." The massive bioconstructs reached the outer defensive perimeter and began smashing through the barriers like they were made of paper. Energy blasts from their weapon pods struck the walls, melting metal and stone. Smaller creatures swarmed around their feet, looking for gaps in the defense. "We can't stop them from here," Lieutenant Choi said. "They'll overrun us in minutes." "Captain." Lee's response shocked everyone. "Then we advance." "Sir?" Corporal Park's voice was uncertain. "You heard me. We're going to hit them before they can organize. Jiho, I need you to take out the support structures on that lead bioconstruct. Sora, coordinate with the other medics for battlefield treatment. Dongsu, find high ground and start picking off the harvesters. Heejin, rally the remaining defenders for a counterattack." Velthar stared at the human captain. "You want to attack? Those things are 50 times our size." "The bigger they are," Captain Lee replied, checking his weapon, "the more ways they can break." What happened next went against everything Velthar had learned about military tactics. Instead of falling back to secondary positions, the human squad jumped over the defensive wall and charged directly at the approaching monsters. They were terrified. Velthar could see it clearly now. Private Kim's face was pale. Corporal Park's hands were shaking as he prepared his explosives. Sergeant Yoon's breathing was rapid and shallow, but they ran toward the enemy anyway. Velthar found himself following them, not because of orders or duty, but because watching them advance while he stayed safe felt like cowardice. If these soft, short-lived humans could charge into nightmare, then a Catherian warrior could do no less. The counterattack was chaos. Corporal Park somehow got close enough to plant explosives on the leading bioconstruct's joints. The detonations did not kill the massive creature, but they slowed it down and made it stumble. Sergeant Yoon found a position on top of a collapsed wall and began systematically shooting harvesters. Each shot was perfect, hitting critical systems that caused the creatures to shut down or explode. Private Kim ran between wounded defenders, dragging them to safety, while enemy fire exploded around her. She never stopped moving, never hesitated, even when a harvester got within meters of her position. Lieutenant Choi somehow managed to coordinate the scattered alien forces into effective fire teams. She used hand signals and radio calls to direct concentrated attacks on key targets. Captain Lee led from the front, using his basic projectile weapon to devastating effect. He seemed to know exactly where to hit each creature to cause maximum damage. When his ammunition ran out, he picked up weapons from fallen defenders and kept fighting. Velthar watched all this while providing covering fire with his plasma rifle. The humans were not stronger than other species. Their weapons were not more advanced. Their armor was not better. But they had something else. Something that kept them moving when logic said they should retreat. Something that let them function, while terrified. The tide of battle began to turn. Other alien defenders, inspired by the human example, started advancing as well. The massive bioconstructs found themselves surrounded and under attack from multiple directions. One by one, the hegemony shock troops began to fall. The lead bioconstruct collapsed when its damaged joints finally gave out. Harvesters ran out of ammunition or were destroyed by focused fire. The smaller creatures, without the massive units to provide cover, became easy targets. When the last enemy fell, the battlefield went quiet, except for the groans of wounded and the crackle of burning equipment. Velthar looked around at the devastation. They had won, but barely. Captain Lee was sitting on a piece of rubble trying to stop bleeding from a gash in his leg. Velthar approached him carefully. "Captain," Velthar said, "how did you know that would work?" Lee looked up at him with tired eyes. "I didn't, but staying in the bunkers would have gotten us all killed or captured. Sometimes the only way out is through." "But you were afraid," Velthar said. "I could see it. You were all afraid." Captain Lee nodded slowly. "Of course we were afraid. Fear keeps you alive. It makes you think faster, move quicker, hit harder. The trick is not letting it paralyze you." Velthar thought about this as he helped bandage the captain's wound. "My people believe fear is weakness. Your people never had to fight for their survival every day for millions of years," Lee replied. "Fear taught us how to stay alive when everything was trying to kill us. It's not our enemy. It's our teacher." As Velthar looked around at the human squad regrouping and treating their wounds, he began to understand. These humans had not overcome their fear. They had learned to use it. They had made it into a weapon. And for the first time since the battle began, Velthar thought they might actually survive this war. The victory celebration was short. Within hours of defeating the third wave, new intelligence arrived that made everyone's blood run cold. The hegemony had not sent their full force. What they had faced was just a probe. The real invasion fleet was still coming. Velthar stood in the command bunker, listening to the briefing with growing dread. The holographic display showed enemy positions that covered half the planet, millions of bioconstructs, thousands of ships, harvester factories that could turn entire populations into hegemony forces within days. Estimated enemy strength is 10 million units, the Zentorian commander said. His gray skin had turned almost white. "Our remaining forces number less than 200 combat-effective soldiers. 10 million. The number was so large it did not seem real. Velthar had always believed that superior training and technology could overcome any odds, but this was beyond mathematics. This was extinction. Around the room, alien officers began discussing evacuation plans. Some wanted to retreat to the next star system. Others suggested calling for reinforcements that would take weeks to arrive. All of them seemed to accept that the colony was lost. "We stay." Captain Lee's voice cut through the discussions. Everyone turned to look at the human captain. His leg was still bandaged from the previous battle and exhaustion lined his face, but his voice was firm. "Captain Lee," the Zentorian commander said carefully, "perhaps you do not understand the odds we face." "I understand perfectly," Lee replied. 10 million enemies, 200 defenders, a civilian population that will be harvested if we fail. Math was never my strong subject, but those numbers seem clear enough. "Then you agree we should evacuate?" a Saurian officer asked. "No. We dig in and fight." The room erupted in protests. Velthar heard words like suicide and insanity being thrown around, but he also noticed that the other human officers were nodding in agreement with their captain. "You cannot be serious," the Zentorian commander said. "This is not bravery, this is madness." Lieutenant Choi stepped forward. "The nearest evacuation point is 6 hours away. The hegemony will be here in 4. Even if we could get all the civilians out, which we cannot, they would just follow us to the next world. This is where we make our stand." "But how can 200 soldiers stop 10 million enemies?" A Vespian officer buzzed anxiously. Corporal Park spoke up from the back of the room. "We don't have to stop them all. We just have to stop them from taking the civilians. And we have advantages they don't know about." "What advantages?" Velthar asked. He genuinely wanted to know how these humans could remain calm in the face of impossible odds. Sergeant Yoon pointed to the tactical display. "The mining colony has extensive underground tunnels. We can use them to move unseen. The enemy bioconstructs are too large to follow us down there. The colony's main reactor can be overloaded," Private Kim added quietly. "If we time it right, we can take out a significant portion of their landing force." "And then what?" the Zentorian commander demanded. "You destroy some of their forces and yourselves in the process. The rest of them will still harvest the survivors." Captain Lee walked over to the display and began pointing to different locations. "We hurt them where it counts. Their command ships, their harvester factories, Their communication networks. We don't try to win a conventional battle. We make it too expensive for them to stay. Velthar studied the human faces around the room. They were discussing their own deaths with the same calm efficiency they had shown planning the previous battle, but underneath their professional demeanor he could see the fear. It was always there, lurking behind their eyes. Yet they were planning to fight anyway. Why? Velthar asked suddenly. The word came out louder than he intended. Everyone looked at him. Why would you do this? You know you will die. Your species values individual life. This makes no logical sense. Captain Lee was quiet for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried to every corner of the room. My daughter lives on Earth, he said. She's 7 years old. She likes to draw pictures of flowers and show them to me over video calls. If the hegemony wins, here they'll keep spreading. Eventually they'll reach Earth. Eventually, they'll reach her. He looked around the room at the other officers. All of us have people we're fighting for. Family, friends, strangers we've never met but who deserve to live free. That's worth dying for. Private Kim nodded. My brother was captured by raiders, but my sister escaped. She's in a refugee camp on Proxima Station. If we don't stop them here, the hegemony will reach her too. Sergeant Yoon checked his rifle for the 100th time. I don't have family left, but I've seen what these monsters do to civilians. No one else should have to go through that. Corporal Park was studying demolition plans on a smaller display. We all die someday anyway. Might as well make it count. For something. Lieutenant Choi turned to address the alien officers. You don't have to stay. Get your people out if you can. We'll buy you as much time as possible. Several of the alien officers began to leave. Velthar did not blame them. The logical choice was to retreat and fight another day. The human plan was insane by any reasonable standard. But as Velthar watched the humans calmly preparing for their final battle, he made a decision that surprised him. I will stay, he announced. Captain Lee looked at him with surprise. You don't have to do this, Velthar. Your people need experienced warriors for the war effort. My people need to learn something, Velthar replied. And I think you are the ones who can teach it. A few other alien officers also chose to stay. Not many, but enough to bring their final force to about 50 soldiers. 50 defenders against 10 million attackers. Over the next few hours, Velthar watched the humans prepare for battle with methodical precision. They mapped out tunnel networks and identified choke points. They prepared explosives and booby traps. They established communication protocols and fallback positions. But most importantly, they talked to each other. About their families. About their fears. About what they hoped to accomplish. Velthar had never seen soldiers discuss their terror so openly. In Catherian military culture, fear was something to be hidden and overcome. But the humans seemed to treat it as useful information to be shared and processed. Scared? Corporal Park asked Velthar as they set up explosive charges in the main tunnel. Terrified, Velthar admitted. It was the first time he had said those words out loud. Good, Park replied. Means your brain is working properly. Fear keeps you sharp. As the enemy fleet appeared in the sky above them, Velthar realized something profound. He had spent his entire life trying to eliminate fear, thinking it made him weak. But these humans had shown him something different. Fear did not make them weak. It made them human. And being human, Velthar was beginning to understand, was far more powerful than he had ever imagined. The final battle was about to begin, and for the first time in his life, Velthar was ready to fight alongside his fear instead of against it. The hegemony fleet darkened the sky like a swarm of metal insects. Velthar crouched in the tunnel entrance, watching through his scope as millions of bioconstructs poured from the landing ships. The ground shook with their footsteps. The air filled with the sound of alien roars and mechanical grinding. Beside him, Captain Lee spoke quietly into his radio. All units, remember the plan. We're not trying to win. We're trying to hurt them badly enough that they think twice about the next colony. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. While the main hegemony force secured the surface, Small human teams would strike critical targets underground. The colony's reactor would be rigged to overload when the enemy forces were directly above it. Supply depots would be destroyed. Command ships would be targeted with everything they had. It was a suicide mission disguised as guerrilla warfare. Movement on the surface, Sergeant Yoon reported from his overwatch position. Lead elements are approaching the colony buildings. Velthar watched through his scope as the first bioconstructs reached the abandoned structures above them. The creatures were even larger than the ones they had fought before. Some were the size of buildings, walking on dozens of legs. Others flew through the air on wings made of bone and flesh. Behind them came the harvesters, thousands of them, spreading, out to search for survivors. Their surgical tools gleamed in the alien light from the ships above. Phase 1. Execute, Captain Lee ordered. Corporal Park triggered the first set of explosives. The charges detonated in sequence, bringing down several buildings on top of the advancing bioconstructs. Debris rained from the ceiling of the tunnel, but the explosions served their purpose. The enemy formation was disrupted. Direct hit on 3 large units, Lieutenant Choi reported. They're reorganizing. The hegemony response was swift and brutal. Energy weapons fired down into the rubble, trying to flush out the defenders. Bioconstructs began digging through the collapsed buildings, searching for tunnel entrances. They're adapting faster than expected, Sergeant Yoon observed. We need to move to Phase 2. Phase 2 was where things got truly dangerous. The human teams would have to leave the safety of the tunnels and attack the enemy ships directly. It meant exposing themselves to the full force of the hegemony army. Remember, Captain Lee said as they prepared to move out, we're not trying to survive this. We're trying to make them pay. Velthar followed the human squad through the tunnel network toward their target, a command ship that had landed near the colony's main reactor. If they could destroy it, the enemy coordination would be disrupted long enough for the other teams to complete their missions. As they moved through the underground passages, Velthar marveled at how calm the humans remained. Private Kim checked her medical supplies with steady hands. Corporal Park prepared his demolition charges with professional precision. Sergeant Yoon cleaned his rifle one last time. They were all going to die in the next few hours. They knew it. Velthar knew it, but none of them seemed paralyzed by the knowledge. How do you do it? Velthar asked Captain Lee as they approached the exit point nearest their target. Do what? Accept death so easily. My people fear death above all else. It makes us fight harder, but it also makes us desperate. You seem peaceful. Captain Lee thought for a moment before answering. We learned a long time ago that fighting to avoid dying is not the same as fighting to protect life. One makes you desperate, the other makes you strong. They reached the exit point. Above them, Velthar could hear the sounds of the enemy securing the area. Heavy footsteps, alien voices, the whir of scanning equipment, contacts directly above. Us, Sergeant Yoon whispered. At least 20 hostiles. We go up fast and hard, Captain Lee decided. Jiho, clear us a path. Everyone else follow me to the command ship. Velthar, watch our 6. Corporal Park armed a flashbang grenade and tossed it up through the tunnel opening. The explosion was followed by inhuman shrieks and the sound of bodies hitting the ground. Move! They burst from the tunnel into chaos. Damaged bioconstructs thrashed around them, blinded and disoriented by the grenade. Velthar's plasma rifle cut through them with surgical precision, while the humans advanced toward their target. The command ship loomed above them like a metal mountain. Its surface was covered in weapon ports and sensor arrays. Bioconstructs swarmed around its base, providing security. There, Lieutenant Choi pointed to an access port halfway up the ship's hull. If we can get inside, we can reach the reactor core. Getting there meant crossing 200 meters of open ground while under fire from dozens of enemies. It should have been impossible. But the humans began their assault anyway. Sergeant Yoon found a position behind some debris and began picking off sentries with impossible accuracy. Each shot dropped a bioconstruct, creating gaps in the defensive. Line Private Kim and Lieutenant Choi provided covering fire while Corporal Park ran toward the ship with his demolition charges. Energy blasts exploded around him, but he kept moving. Captain Lee led the main assault, using nothing but his projectile weapon and tactical awareness to punch through the enemy formation. Velthar followed, watching in amazement as the human somehow anticipated every enemy move. They reached the ship's hull just as alarm signals began blaring from inside. The access port was sealed, but Corporal Park's explosives made short work of the barrier. Inside, the command ship was a nightmare of biomechanical fusion. Living walls pulsed with alien heartbeats. Organic computers processed data through neural networks that had once been thinking beings. The air was thick with the smell of decay and chemical preservation. "Reactor core is 3 levels down, Lieutenant," Choi said, consulting a map she had memorized. "We have maybe 10 minutes before they organize a response." They fought their way through corridors filled with harvester units and modified crew members. Velthar's fear had transformed into something else now. Not the paralyzing terror he had felt before, but a sharp, focused energy that made him faster and more accurate. He was learning to use his fear the way the humans did. The reactor core was a massive chamber filled with pulsing energy conduits and biological control systems. At its center was the main power source, a contained star that provided energy for the entire ship. "This is it," Corporal Park said, placing his remaining charges around the containment field generators. "When this goes, it'll take out half the landing zone." "How long do we have?" Captain Lee asked. 2 minutes after I trigger the timer. Not enough time to get clear." Everyone understood. This was the end of the mission. The end of everything. Velthar expected to feel fear again, but instead he felt something else, something that might have been peace. "Captain," he said, "I need to tell you something." Lee looked at him while Corporal Park made final adjustments to the charges. "Before this battle, I thought courage meant never being afraid," Velthar said. "I thought my people were superior because we had eliminated fear from our warriors. But I was wrong." "How so?" "You have taught me that courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act in spite of fear. And the reason you can do that is because you fight for something larger than yourselves." Captain Lee smiled, and for the first time since Velthar had met him, it was a truly happy expression. "You understand." "Ready to trigger," Corporal Park announced. They gathered in a circle. These soldiers who had chosen to die together rather than let evil spread unchecked. Velthar looked at each human face and saw not fear, but determination. Not despair, but hope. "Any last words?" Captain Lee asked. Private Kim spoke first. "Tell my sister I kept my promise. Sergeant Yoon. Someone needs to remember what happened here. Lieutenant Choi. Make sure they know the price of freedom. Corporal Park. Timers. Active. 30 seconds. Captain Lee looked at Velthar. "What about you?" Velthar thought about his people, safe in their ships far from this battle. He thought about what he would tell them if he could, about what these humans had taught him. "Battling beside humans was the first time I truly felt fear," he said, "but it was also the first time I truly understood courage." The explosion lit up the sky for 100 kilometers. When the rescue ships arrived 3 days later, they found a crater where the Hegemony Command Center had been. The enemy fleet had retreated, their losses too heavy to justify continued assault. The official reports listed the defenders as missing in action, but among the debris, investigators found a recording device that had somehow survived the blast. On it was the final transmission from Captain Lee's unit, broadcast on all frequencies in the moments before the reactor overloaded. The message was simple. This is what it costs to threaten innocence. This is what humans do when you push too far. Remember that. The recording was distributed throughout the galaxy. Within weeks, 3 more hegemony invasions were abandoned when the attackers realized they would be facing human-trained defenders. The war continued for several more years, but the tide had turned. Other species began to learn what Velthar had discovered in those final moments, that true strength comes not from the absence of fear, but from the willingness to act despite it. And sometimes, when the stakes are high enough, even the most terrifying enemy can be made to feel fear themselves.